How do we worship the gods? How do we build altars? Is there a correct way to worship? In this video mini-series, we'll be answering these questions and more. If you're new to Heathenry, these videos will help you learn how to worship the gods in your daily life. This video will be covering the historical and lore-based information of worship. Along the way, we'll also be dispelling some of the most common misconceptions in Norse Heathenry concerning worship, prayer, and sacrifice. The last two misconceptions we talk about at the end of this video are, undoubtedly, the biggest misconceptions in Heathenry, and what people are most shocked to find out, even longtime heathens. So without further delay, let's dive into today's first subject, the sacred space. When talking about worship, one of the most prominent aspects usually brought up is creating or finding a sacred space. These spaces can be created, as in the case of Horgar and Hofs, or found, as in the case with locations such as Helgafjell. For the purpose of this video though, we'll be focusing on man-made sacred spaces rather than natural ones for the sake of applicability. The first such sacred space that can be created that is in line with the lore is a temple or Hof. The lore is rich with attestations of temples to the gods and of temple priests, and it's here that we come across a rather large misconception in modern heathenry, that arch-heathens didn't build and worship in temples. The misconception holds that the arch-heathens worshipped in nature, prayed in nature, and didn't have temples or organized worship. While it is true that certain groups of arch-heathens worshipped in natural places such as groves, it is untrue that the arch-heathens didn't build temples. The lore is full of examples of the arch-heathens having temples dedicated to the gods, and even having temple priests who oversaw the temples, indicating organized worship. One well-known example of this can be found in Egil's saga, where this description is given for one of its characters. Odd was then headman in Borgarfjörð, south of White River. He was temple priest and ruled over that temple, to which all paid tribute within Skardshearth. Egil's saga, chapter 89. In this we can discern that not only did the arch-heathens have and worship in temples, but they also paid tribute to them, proving the existence of religious organization in the Norse sect of arch-heathenry. For further references to temples, let's take a look at the Poetic Edda, beginning with stanza 7 of the Völuspá. At Idavoll the mighty gods met, shrines and temples they timbered high, forges they set and they smithied o'er, tongs they wrought and tools they fashioned. This is a fascinating stanza because here we have the gods building temples and shrines. It is unclear as to why the gods themselves would be building shrines and temples and to whom they were building them, but such information is lost to us today. Continuing on, we can find a direct reference to a temple of Njörð in the Grimnismál, stanza 16. The 11th is Nóatún. There has Njörð for himself a dwelling set, the sinless ruler of men there sits, in his temple timbered high. This stanza actually presents an issue with attempting to draw a line between the temples and the Horgar, as this stanza actually uses the word Horgi in Old Norse in the last line, as opposed to the word most typically used for temples, which is Hof or sometimes Ve, which can also refer to shrines and temples. It uses the word Horgi in reference to the home of Njörð and Nóatún, because it also used the word Salar in the third line, confirming that the Horgar is referencing Njörð's hall. This lends itself to the understanding of Horgar not just as altar, as it's used in some instances, but also sanctuary. For verification of this understanding, we can look to section 14 of the Prose Edda. They made also a second hall, that was a shrine which the goddesses had, and it was a very fair house. Men call it Vingolf. Here we have the word for hall in this sentence, sal and later hus or house in Old Norse, also referred to as a shrine, or horgr. This validates, at least in part, an understanding of the word horgr as a building alongside its definition as an altar, built in dedication to the gods, or in this instance, the goddesses. The reason why it is necessary to have a secondary understanding of the word horgr is because it is used alongside words for buildings, namely sal or hall, and even hus, house. We can also find a reference to Njörð having many such temples and shrines in the Vafthrudnismál, stanza 38, and we can find a brief explanation of what a temple sacrifice was like in the Ynglinga saga, chapter 2, which is elaborated on in greater detail in the explanation of blot that can be found in the saga of Hakon the Good, which we'll be covering in detail later on in this video. Now that we've covered temples and the importance of temples, let's explore another sacred space in heathenry that we've talked a little bit about, the Horgr. Horgr are usually stacks of stones that are used for sacrifice, as mentioned most in depth in the Hyndluljóð. For me a shrine of stones he made, and now to glass the rock has grown. Oft with the blood of beasts it was red, in the goddesses ever did Otar trust. Here we can see that the Horgar can be a stack of stones that had blood from sacrifices poured over them, effectively making them outdoor altars. These outdoor altars appear in the lore alongside references of temples, seeming to say that the building of both in the honor of the gods was a common occurrence. We don't know what kind of stones were used, or if a particular style of construction was favored, or how many forms these shrines took. But from the sources' descriptions of Horgar, most appear to simply be cairns of stones that were used for the purpose of sacrifice. It should also be said, given the sources' depictions of Horgar, that these sacrificial stone mounds appear to serve both as cult sites, when mentioned alongside temples to the gods, and as personal altars, like the one described in the Himmelioth. It should also be said that, using our understanding of Horgar that we built on during the discussion about temples, that it's possible that not all Horgar were simply stone cairns. They could also be sanctuaries dedicated to the gods. Later on in this video, we'll explore another interesting depiction of what is believed to be a Horgar. Part 2. Sacred Objects. The construction of sacred spaces, whether they're Horgar or temples, is extremely important in heathenry as they show our dedication to the gods. Now that we've covered the types of sacred spaces most common in Norse heathenry, let's move on to another facet of sacred spaces, which are sacred objects. What did the arch-heathens use within their sacred spaces? This question is one of the most frequently asked and thankfully one of the most easy to answer. We'll start by taking a look at one of the most important tools in a temple's trade, the humble kettle. The use of the kettle in a religious sense is one of great importance. The kettle, while today just a simple tool for boiling food, can be seen playing a prominent role in several instances within the lore. To get us started, let's take a look at how it was used in the temples. In the Saga of Hakon the Good, we see the humble kettle being held over the temple fires and used to boil the meat of the sacrificial animals. We can confirm this in the soup reference mentioned in section 17 of the Saga of Hakon the Good. It should also be said that the boiling of animal meat was a very common practice and wasn't just a religious act. We can see this in several poems, namely in the Heimskvida and in the Rigssola. These animals whose meat were boiled, they were killed during the blot, mentioned in section 17 of the Saga of Hakon the Good. The consumption of these sacrifices was so important in the Saga of Hakon the Good that the followers of Jarl Sigurd were deeply offended that he refused to partake in the consumption and essentially threatened him into doing so. Our next example of the importance of the kettle is in creating something that was held in high regard, religiously speaking, and recreationally speaking, to the arch-heathens: alcohol. In an extremely famous example found in stanza 14 of the Heimskvida, the sea giant Aegir tasked Thor and Tyr with bringing him a kettle large enough to brew ale for the gods. This kettle was said to be a mile deep, a testament to the constitution of the gods to drink so much ale. One very special kettle was also used to make a particular sacred alcohol in our next example, and its name is Oðreyrir. For more lore-versed viewers, the name of the sacred alcohol that was created will be immediately familiar: the mead of poetry. This mead was made with the blood of the god Kvasir, who was created by the Aesir and the Vanir in a peacemaking ceremony. We learn of this story in the Prose Edda, where the dwarves Fjalar and Gjalar kill Kvasir and drain his blood into the kettle Oðreyrir and into two vats known respectively as Bolden and Son. They then make mead of his blood by mixing in honey, and thus the mead of poetry was made. We'll go fully into this story in another video because the mead of poetry and the events that follow it are a bit beyond the scope of this video and definitely deserve their own. The final example we'll cover actually states a sacred use of the kettles in explicit terms. In Guðrúnar Kvíða 3, stanzas 6 and 7, Old Norse version, we learn that it was a practice for men to hollow kettles, as seen by Gudrun's requesting of Atli to bring Saxi, the king of the Sudruns, who appeared to have a knowledge of how to conduct this blessing, to bless the kettle for her ordeal of boiling water. To explain the context of Guðrúnar Kvíða 3, the kettle is used to determine the innocence of Gudrun, who was accused of adultery by Hyrkja, a servant and once concubine of Atli. Gudrun thrust her hand into the boiling kettle and retrieved a stone, thus proving her innocence. Hyrkja was made to do the same to prove that she wasn't knowingly making a false claim, and her hand was severely burned. Hyrkja was then executed by being thrown into a bog. In summary, we've learned 3 religious uses of a kettle: to boil sacrificial meat, to make alcohol used in rituals, and to prove the innocence or guilt of someone if such is in question. The next sacred tools we'll be looking at is the drinking bowl, or horn in some instances, and alcohol. We can find perhaps one of the most important references to such bowls in the Saga of Hakon the Good, section 14. We learn here that the bowls are brought to the fires of the temple and filled with alcohol, and then hallowed by the leader or hovding. 5 such bowls were drank during the ritual, 1 to Odin, 1 to Njord, 1 to Freyr, 1 to Bragi, and 1 to the ancestors. This practice is also attested to in the saga of St. Olaf, section 107, although in less detail. In chapter 44 of Egil's saga, we see a good deal of drinking at a feast hosted by Bard. During this feast, there was a sacrifice to the guardian spirits, of which are unnamed, and there was a good deal of drinking. This seems to solidify the importance of drinking in religious contexts. This is further underscored by Bard's consecration of the ale in the same chapter, reminiscent of Saga of Hakon the Good, section 14. We also see alcohol being a key component in a strange place, oath-making. In Helga Kvide Horvarssonar, in the prose section between stanzas 30 and 31. That evening the great vows were taken, the sacred boar was brought in, the men laid their hands thereon and took their vows at the king's toast. Heathen vowed that he would have Svafa, Eilimi's daughter, the beloved of his brother Helgi. Then such great grief seized him that he went forth on wild paths, southward over the land, and found Helgi his brother. Here we see that vows are taken at the king's toast. This is interesting because drinking can cause a lapse in judgment. However, in the eyes of the arch-heathens, this fact appeared to be overlooked as the oaths made in the way specified in Helga Kvide Horvarssonar held the weight of oaths no matter how drunk the individual was. This exact passage confirms this, as Heathen would have been rather drunk when he swore that he would take Svafa from Helgi, an oath that later would be kept. The next sacred objects we'll take a look at are the Hlaut bowl and the Hlaut tainer, or Hlaut twigs. The Hlaut bowl is said in the saga of Hakon the Good to be the bowl that is used to catch the blood of the sacrificed animal, the bowl that catches the Hlaut, or sacrificial blood. This blood is then sprinkled on the participants using the Hlaut tain, or sacrificial blood twig, and also on the temple walls as a blessing. The next sacred object we'll be covering is the sacred oath ring. This ring appears to only have been used within temples and things as a ring on which men made oaths during court sessions. This ring would be worn by the leader of these things, who would receive the oaths of men. There within was there a great frith place, but off in inmost house was there another house, of that fashion whereof now is the choir of a church. And there stood a stall in the midst of the floor in the fashion of an altar, and thereon lay a ring without a join that weighed 20 ounces. And on that must men swear all oaths, and that ring must the chief have on his arm at all man-motes. Chapter 4, Eyrbyggja Saga. It should be said that oath rings of other types existed, but this specific oath ring is, as shown here, tied to the heathen temple and its leader. The final sacred object we'll be covering is one that most people have now, god statues. Statues of the gods are well attested to, especially in temples, even though few have ever actually been discovered. These statues, while not believed to have been the gods themselves, were often used as a focus for worship, as it appears that the arch-heathens believed that the gods, in some fashion, worked through them. We can see this belief well documented in chapter 4 of Eyrbyggja Saga in the passage below. Thorolf Mostbeard made a great sacrifice, and asked of Thor, his well-beloved friend, whether he should make peace with the king, or get him gone from out the land and seek other fortunes. But the word showed Thorolf to Iceland, and thereafter he got himself a great ship meet for the main, and trimmed it for the Iceland faring, and had with him his kindred and his household goods, and many friends of his betook themselves to faring with him. He pulled down the temple, and had with him most of the timbers which had been therein, and mulled moreover from under the stall whereon Thor had sat. Thereafter Thorolf sailed into the main sea, and had wind at will, and made land, and south sailed along the west about Reekness, and then fell the wind, and then they saw that 2 big bights cut into the land. Then Thorolf cast overboard the pillars of his high seat, which had been in the temple, and on one of them was Thor carven. Withal he spake over them, that he would abide in Iceland, whereas Thor should let those pillars come aland. But when they drifted off the ship, they were borne towards the westernmost firth in sight, and folk deemed that they went in sooth no slower than might have been looked for. After that came a sea breeze, and they sailed west about Snøfellsnes, and stood into the firth. There they see that the firth is mighty broad and long, with great fells rising on either side thereof. Then Thorolf gave name to the firth and called it Broadfirth. He took land on the south side of the firth, nigh the midmost, and laid his ship in the creek, which thereafter they called Templewick. Thereafter they espied the land, and found on the outmost point of the ness north of the bay that Thor was come aland with the pillars. That was afterwards called Thorsness. We can also find worship of god statues attested to in Ibn Fowland's Sign of Darkness, page 64. As soon as their boats arrive at this port, each of them disembarks, taking with him bread, meat, onions, milk, and nabid. He walks until he comes to a great wooden post stuck in the ground with a face like that of a man, and around it are little figures. Behind these images there are long wooden stakes driven into the ground. Each of them prostrates himself before the great idol, saying to it, "O my lord, I have come from a far country, and I have with me such and such a number of young slave girls, and such a number of sable skins," and so on until he has listed all the trade goods he has brought. Then he adds, "I have brought you this gift." Then he leaves what he has with him in front of the wooden post and says, "I would like you to do the favor of sending me a merchant who has large quantities of dinars and dirhams, and who will buy everything that I want and not argue with me over my price." He then departs. If he has difficulty selling and his stay becomes long and drawn out, he returns with another present, a second time and even a third time. If he cannot get what he wants, he brings a present for each of the little idols and asks them to intercede, saying, "These are the wives of our Lord and his daughters and sons." Thus he continues to make his request to each idol in turn, begging their intercession and abasing himself before them. Sometimes the sale is easy, and after having sold his goods, he says, "My Lord has satisfied my needs, and it is fitting that I should reward him for it." Then he takes a certain number of sheep or cows and slaughters them, distributing part of the meat as gifts and carrying off the rest to set before the great idol and the little figures that surround it. Then he hangs the heads of the sheep or cows on the wooden stakes which have been driven into the ground. When night falls, the dogs come and eat all of this, and the man who had brought the offering says, "My Lord is pleased with me and has eaten the gifts that I brought for him." As we can see, the use of statues to commune with the gods is a well-documented practice, both in our lore and in the attestations of outsiders. This solidifies god statues as a sacred object in heathenry. We can also add this instance to our understanding of the word horgr as shrine, as the above passage from Ibn Fadlan's Land of Darkness is clearly referencing a shrine built to the gods. We can also now debunk two of heathenry's greatest myths using this passage. One, that the arch-heathens didn't bow to the gods, and two, that blood sacrifice was the only form of acceptable sacrifice. Through this passage, we can see that the arch-heathens saw the gods as greater than they were, and that they believed that the gods found value in votive offerings and offerings of food, not just blood offerings. This video has been an absolute blast to make, and we are extremely excited to continue this mini-series on worshiping the gods next week, where we'll be covering how to incorporate the information we went over in this video into your life and into your religious practice. Make sure to give this video a like if you found it useful, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you don't miss out on next week's video. Thank you guys so much for sitting here with me today. My name is Gavin. From our heathen household to yours, we'll see you in our next video.